I'm a single man in my early 30s. I got a brother who's 29 and he's already got 4 kids now. He had his first at 22 and the second followed a year later. Then the third 2 years after that, the most recent addition to the family, my soul, arrived just a couple of months ago. I have to admit I don't always see eye to eye with her. She has this way of acting superior, and I love how she can rile me up. She's a real drama queen when I try to retaliate, but she's also the most compassionate person I know. My parents and brother are head over heels for her, and they know exactly how she really is, but they don't care. She's got a great smile, I'll give her that. But I have to admit she can be a bit of a handful. She also refuses to get any sort of job, even though she has a college degree. My mother is a dedicated and loving parent who dedicates most of her day to taking care of the kids. Their finances are entirely dependent on my brother, which is a great opportunity for him to be a hands-on parent. This means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. Currency might be a bit of an issue with all of them under one roof in a 3-bedroom house that was built in the 60s.
This is our Life channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please join us to stay updated with more real stories happening around you.
But that's all part of the adventure. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. We're 3 years apart in age, and he developed a superiority complex because he was badly punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way. Back then, it was clear that my parents showered him with extra love and attention, and he got the biggest share of everything. Other family members occasionally pointed out the canes, which led to my parents moving us up to 150 miles away to create a more balanced environment. This meant that we only got to see them during holidays, but those holidays were always filled with fun and excitement. My brother showed his playful side by flirting with my first girlfriend, and he had a good laugh at any little mishap I might have had. My parents were always soft-hit, encouraging me to keep my chin up and keep moving forward. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I must admit it was a riot to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me as equals on birthdays and Christmas in front of other people. We had relatives who were very nosy and loved gossiping drama. My parents did their best to keep things under wraps, and even threatened to take my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. It was a bit of a laugh, to be honest. When I turned 18 and moved out, it meant my parents didn't have to provide for me anymore, and they celebrated by treating me like a grown-up. I was still in high school when I moved out, and I am so glad I had the chance to make my own way. But I was thrilled to be living on my own, and I loved spending time with my friends. I was low contact ever since leaving home, and I am happy to say that I am doing great. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation. But that was okay because I was excited to start a new chapter in my life. But from that point on, I was set free. I would get to see my parents and brother on holidays just like the rest of the family. The start of 2020 was a bit of a challenge, but I took it in my stride. I lost my job, and unfortunately I couldn't renew the lease on my condo, because my roommate also lost his job. We were both going through a rough time financially, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I absolutely adored. As the lease was ending, my roommate left early to move back in with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize to an extreme. I learned a valuable lesson. Next time I am renting a place that's more within my budget. I relished the luxury, but life had other plans. I realized that I should have been living somewhere far cheaper, so I could have saved more money to fall back on. But I had a plan. I've always had a passion for trucks, so I bought a truck simply because I've always loved trucks. I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck, just so I could live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be a temporary adventure, but I ended up living out of it for a lot longer than I had anticipated. I was able to live out of the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still live. When I asked my parents if I could stay for a while, they said they had a full house and didn't want me there. We hadn't exactly seen eye to eye over the past decade, but that's okay. They said they'd only agreed to let me park my camper there, if I paid them basically what it had cost to rent an apartment in my area. Which was way too much just to part of my camper. I was jobless, but I was determined to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I could find a new job. I could have just as easily been living in an apartment with that rent price they were asking. My parents jokingly called my camper an eyesore and suggested I take a hike since we couldn't reach an agreement. And CEO thought it was absolutely hilarious. I had to live in a camper, but I was excited to see what the next chapter would bring. My brother joined in the fun, pointing and laughing at me while calling me a homeless bum. I decided to take the plunge and park my truck camper in a store parking lot for the first night. I felt a bit anxious, as you might expect, thinking about the possibility of someone trying to break in. I had a great night's sleep, even if I did toss and turn a bit. There was nowhere else I could go, as any other relatives that owned houses were fairly far away, and all my friends were apartment dwellers. I was pretty attached to my area as well. I didn't want to leave, but I was open to the possibilities. I'd also had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment, which was super convenient. It was the only way I could still get my mail. I was determined to find a stable place to park, and I am happy to report that I did. I went looking around to try and find a job similar to my old one. After months of living the nomadic camp life, I was ready for change. During that time, I encountered all sorts of people, from those in need to those who had different opinions about my camper. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be within a house. I wasn't even parked on a street with houses, so that was a bit of a surprise. When I asked about this highway, they became quite agitated and even threatened me. I decided to move my camper anyway, just to avoid any potential trouble. I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know it's not the best solution, but it's essential to keep my refrigerator cold. I had a small solar power bag for recharging my phone, but I didn't have a generator. Generators are noisy and require fuel, but I was determined to find a solution. After months of living on my wits, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to relocate to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail, but that's all part of the adventure. I had a blast working retail back in college, and I promised myself I'd never go back to that, but I was almost ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money, but I had no stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to still be jobless when it ran out. I was also eager to explore new opportunities and experiences. I had a few things to do, like watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I could park and which local public bathrooms I could use. I really admire the Japanese public bathhouses. We could really use stuff like that over here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the bucket of the building by the warehouse, and old employees in fully parking spaces were tucked away in the back. And no one seemed to use them because they were so far in the back that the area was borderline forgotten. My awesome boss, who also happens to be the company owner, loved this arrangement because I was always willing to take on any shift, as long as I got enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I am not entirely sure if this was allowed, but no one seemed to care. During my entire time there, I didn't have to deal with many trespassers, which was a huge relief. There were a few, but the security guards were on top of it and got them out. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me, and I was working virtually every day of the week. My awesome boss let me put my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays, when no one else was in the office but the janitor and security guard. I had the opportunity to shower at a friend's apartment or at my local gym, which was a great way to stay comfortable. The camper was equipped with a portable toilet, so I didn't have to worry about that. So I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse, which was awesome because I could go in to use the bathroom there at any hour. I even got to know the night security guard by first name. He's since become one of my closest friends. The camper was a breeze to heat up in the winter with its little electric heater. Summers were a different story, but that's a whole other adventure. It didn't have AC, but I found a great deal on a used portable air conditioner, and that made a world of difference. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned some new skills from the other employees. By midway through the year, I had an even better position in the company as a supervisor and a salary that was even better than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted the house. The scare I'd gotten from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I started looking for something close to my work, and I was thrilled to find a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property just 2 miles away. I negotiated the price down to $10,000 less than the asking price. With a down payment made up of my savings, I was able to secure a home loan. I finally had the freedom to leave the camper behind and move into a place of my own. There was plenty of space to back my truck in behind the house and set up the camper in the backyard. I put it there as its own little building just in case I want to use it again. Once I was fully settled in the house, I couldn't resist sharing the news on Facebook. My family saw the post, and that's when the real fun began. After a few weeks, my parents and brother, along with his family, came to visit completely unannounced to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address. I am still amazed that they found me, though. None of my friends have confessed, and no prior family members visited me before. That I am starting to wonder if they maybe stalked me at work and followed me home. It would be so funny if that's what happened. When I opened the door, they practically shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists, and then just started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and one of them had this creepy smirk that she kept flashing me, and it was only later that I figured out why. It made me feel like a bull-on frat that just got stung by a hornet. My parents were constantly talking about how I've got so much extra space now, and it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. Sure, not now, but maybe someday, my brother kept remarking, about how there was more space than our parents' house, and my house was closer to his job too. I knew it was a sign. Eventually, my brother asked me to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out onto the front porch. That's when I realized they'd planned something. My brother, let's call him Dan for the sake of simplicity, said the house was too much for me alone, and that I should let him move in with his family, because his wife is pregnant with their 4th child, and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already have the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they live in the main house. I was thrilled at the prospect of living in a camper while they lived in the main house. And best of all, Dan never once spoke of offering rent. And he's got a good job, too. He even started talking about how there would be some fun changes like curfews, and that I'd need to give a little heads up before coming over. If it weren't for the brother, I'd think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. Dan's perspective has certainly changed over time, influenced by our parents' overprotective approach. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. I am not about to rent my house or any part of my house to him, no way. Other people maybe. Just so I can pay the mortgage off more easily, but certainly not him or his wife. I've seen this exact kind of situation in videos online many times, and never once did I think I'd actually live it because I thought it was so ludicrous. But my parents, brother, and Sildu all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic, entitled crazies. So I got my phone, set it to record, and held it close to my chest. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I'd done this, just sitting there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. Then he went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal and trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally showed my backbone and said, "Hell no." I said it loudly enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I'd rarely ever raised my voice to him on that level, because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, and I was in charge. My spine can be as shiny as it wants here. I stood up and told him that my house was not up for grabs. I made it clear that just because they wanted him to move in doesn't mean it'll happen. I bought my house for myself. And it's not my fault. He keeps having more kids and has to live with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me and said that I didn't deserve the house and he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed back at him, saying that I worked hard to buy my house and I deserved it. I told him I totally deserved it. Dan started yelling about how I have no wife or kids and I don't need all the space, so I may as well give it to him. I told him I wasn't giving him anything. He never even offered to pay me rent, which I thought was a pretty generous offer. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in my own house. Then Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first. Our parents said I was going to do this, and I will. I yelled as if their word was law or something, and told Dan that they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then my parents wrote, "1Q my parents," and so barged back into the front door and surrounded me to try and force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting, but to sum it up from this point on, I heard the line, "Just do it," for Dan way more times than I can remember in the fight. I told them they couldn't decide for me, and I told them to get out before I called the cops. Still, she screamed the loudest about how she was pregnant again, and I can't do this to her. I told her I had done nothing to her. She just assumed she could take and take from me. I told her that I would never do that. I made it clear that I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up. You never showed me any respect. I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I'm not going to feel sorry for her. She won't be living in my house. That made her angry enough to attack me. But I am just glad I am not living with her. She gave my face one solid hit, and then my brother intervened, putting an end to the action. She kept demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. But he didn't give in. The phone I was holding captured the entire incident on video. So I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told them they were leaving and I was so happy. Then my mother said that I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I won't be and to not come back. I also let my sister-in-law know that my phone recorded everything, and if she tries anything, I'll press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out loudly, crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door, saying that I better do this for Dan and Sil. I responded by telling her I won't be. As I mentioned in the first half of my post, many will find this unbelievable and wrong, but I am ready to move on. I am well aware that there are similar sounding posts online already. I've seen quite a few of them now, but it's not like those posters have a monopoly on this sort of thing happening to them. I am amazed this site hasn't been better weaponized against this sort of thing. If entitled people were more afraid of getting outed here, we'd see a different outcome. In any case, I don't blame anyone who calls. I would do the same if I were in their situation. By reading this in my first post, you'll get a glimpse into the unique challenges my parents have faced in raising me. They're the reason my brother turned out the way he did. I am curious if they've shared their perspective on my growth and development. I am excited to find out what that reason is. Some people can't explain why they make choices like child favoritism. My parents' instinct is to stand by the child they've backed, and that's exactly what they do. I've practically destroyed their lives for it, and I am not sure I'll ever be able to make it up to them. It's not in a legal sense, but more in an emotional one. I kicked my parents' brother and Sil out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother. I immediately went to my social media and told the whole family about it. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted some time ago. I also took the initiative to put my profile on private. I posted about it because I knew that the first thing my family would do when they got home is try to twist the event to make me the villain. And I was exactly right. I had about an hour to get started before they did, and I made the most of it. I had video evidence to back up my story about what they've done. I'm not planning on sharing the video here though, so don't even ask. I was able to get a fair number of family members on my side right away because I was preemptive. My parents, brother and sister-in-law were so set to write their own post, but they ended up not needing to, so they didn't even bother trying to lie much. My parents Stan and my sister-in-law had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Many others were already aware of their entitled attitude. The result was something they all quickly understood and accepted. There was one person in particular who called me. I don't know who they were, but they called to say that I was a horrible brother and that I needed to make way for a real family man. I ended the call and blocked the number, and that was that. This didn't happen again, and I am glad it didn't. The week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch just like they said they would. In their prior ultimatum, they rang my doorbell nonstop and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened the door a little bit, and they tried to shove their way in again. I had installed latch chains to prevent them from shoving their way in, and I braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother were determined to enter, but I stood my ground. I let them know that I was knock on the whole thing on camera, and that I'd call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother intervened, calming them down, and then, in her most charming dulcet tone, she inquired if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to and never come back. My mother then began to express her feelings, asking me why I couldn't just do this for Dan since he's my beloved brother. I laughed and said, I don't love him as a brother because he treated me like that for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They're not the best parents, and he's a bit of a rough brother. I then made it clear that if they didn't leave, I would call the police. To my surprise, they all left relatively quickly, except for my mother, who was in a bit of a crying spell, and the others who gave me some not-so-subtle looks. It was a bit surprising how easily they left. But I guess that's what happens when you make an unwelcome guest leave. I thought the whole ordeal was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. Later that week, I came home on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family. They were moving in. He gave me a big grin and a wave when he saw me. I was a bit surprised, but I told him that the rest of his family could stop. He gave me a playful smile and said, like it or not, we're moving in. She even tilted her head and puckered her lips in the most adorable way, saying that it was all good because my mom had given it a green light. She always says that I should listen to her, and I love her for it. I felt a surge of energy, and my face felt hot with anger. As I looked at her, I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, cells started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, saying that I can't do this to her because she and Dan need the house. She even cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded with, "Dan, it's my house, not his." She even threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, but I didn't back down. The 911 operator heard all of this thanks to the window being slightly open. I told Silas she damaged my truck and I'd sue her. She was smart enough to retreat at that point. When the police arrived, Dan and Seal, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I was so excited to tell the cops what had happened and show them my new driver's license with my current address on it. Then when we went to my front door, I saw that they'd changed the lock, and the old block was laying on the porch with the center of it drilled out. The drill they used was right next to it, and it was a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. Could they have been any more ingenious? I showed them the broken lock and drill and then gave them a rundown of everything that had happened. I guess Dan called their parents over at some point after I arrived home because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately started lying, saying that I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or another. So Dan and Sil finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They looked pretty pleased with themselves, like they'd outsmarted me. They'd actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature wasn't on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I am pretty sure they've never actually seen my signature. It was a pretty bold move on their part, but I am glad I caught it. I told my parents and Dan, and we all agreed that it was a remarkably obvious fraud. If the cops investigated, they'd easily figure it out. I am sure they'd be able to figure it out in court, and it'd be great to see them get their just desserts. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said that I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken. and I called CPS too for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all that, but my mother jumped in, doubling down on the idea that I should just do this for Dan and live in the camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she should do it for Dan herself and let him have her house to himself instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now, or I'll press charges. I explained that they had drilled out my front door, locked to break in, and the papers were obviously fakes. They had forged my signature, and I was thrilled to see that they had done such a good job. I even recorded videos of the attack. Those are felonies I could over their lives with if I wanted. If they don't leave, I'll do exactly what I am planning. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of the dance kids, so they have one chance to get out. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they could not force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered, saying she put an end to this. She then leaned over to Sil and spoke with her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. Sil instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the bits of paper or he'd cite them for littering. Both of the cops had the "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Meanwhile, Dan enthusiastically encouraged his kids to help load their things back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he wouldn't get his own room. Now Seal and Dan gathered their kids to try one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with a sad family routine. It's a heartwarming scene with everyone gathering together in a tight group hug, facing one direction with a sense of unity and togetherness. I swear they've probably practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. Seal kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy. My brother, with a face that said it all, implored, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." I didn't waver, though, and kept going, telling them to keep packing all the kids and crank up the crying to 11. Dan chimed in with a playful, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you are too selfish to share and help out family," I burst out laughing, responding that he was trying to take, not share. No amount of crime will make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me. It was like so Arvu from when we were kids, and I started to laugh again as I recounted how he used to bomb me back then until the cops told him to stop or he'd be in trouble. He paused, then looked at me, a curious mix of fear and defiance in his eyes. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law had all left. They promised they wouldn't leave until everything was sorted out. In the next few minutes, the number of cops increased from 2 to 4 as more arrived to assist. For whatever reason, that gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock. He put on my front door. I got another lock the next day anyway, because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was hesitant to hand them over, but I managed to convince him. Instead of handing them to me, he playfully tossed them down the street into a storm drain, saying I could go get them myself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to get at them. It was quite the adventure. When he finally got the keys back, he just grumbled and slammed them down into my hand. I then enthusiastically told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat to me, but I didn't care. I told them as much. I added a playful touch of sarcasm, saying, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys, where I always get treated like by you all anyway, because Gano's always been your obvious favorite. I joked that you treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needed an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So do what you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you and suck it up." My parents were amazed when I shared all of this with them. The 4 cops listening to us were pretty judgmental too. I'd say that if you want to put nasty parents like mine on the spot, go ahead and confront them in front of cops. Chances are they won't try anything too crazy. My mother started crying and walking away, which was a first for her. My father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan just held his kids in defeat. And Seal was off having a tantrum in my front lawn. But before long, they all joined forces, helping each other pack up their things and loading them into boxes. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it all went out pretty quickly. My mother kept saying it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Dan. She tried to bargain more and more to try to make me change my mind. She even offered to pay me rent if I'll let them stay, which was pretty generous of her. When that didn't work, she suggested that I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house, so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to keep packing boxes because I am not looking for Dan or his family around. I am not interested in his money. I am not interested in living with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a kid. I am not interested in making a deal with my parents. Seal had another tantrum after hearing that, threw a box down and sat on the ground to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat there looking a little angry and sad until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. Before they left, I had a heart-to-heart with my parents about some of the challenges I faced. Growing up with 4 cops right there, they couldn't do much other than stand there and take it. It was a rare moment of peace. I had so much to share about all the things that had happened. I even told them how they couldn't just do something nice for me like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet, or how they let Dan and so ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house, so Dan could stay in it free of charge. Yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to gouge me for more than I could afford just to park my camper, when they knew I was out of the job. The cops were really impressed with my story, and they were amazed by how I handled it all. I asked my parents a question. What did I do to deserve such treatment, other than being born to you? When I finally had a bit of success in life, they wanted to take it away from me for their favorite child since they'd rather I give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself. I bought my house, using the money that I earned. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again, because clearly I will never be anything more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no answers from them. They just stood there a bit lost. I kept going, asking what made them think they were such good parents. My father was red with embarrassment, but he took it well. My mother was in tears, expressing her belief that she was a horrible person. I wholeheartedly agree with her assessment. They all are. I am sure they'll come around. They were bum people, and they all knew it. If I had confronted them about it in private, they would have gotten mad at me, and they would have continued acting like I was in the wrong. They've been in denial for so long, it's become part of who they are. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket to cry, and my father looked more defeated than I've ever seen him. Dan and his family were focused on putting everything back in the moving truck, so they didn't have much time for socializing. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen. Not that I'd had a chance to get much furniture yet. I was lucky to even have a couch at that time. They all jumped back into their vehicles, and Sue just stood there staring at me with a playful glint in her eye. My brother finally got her to drive the minivan home, and we all headed back to our new place. And as soon as they were all gone, I got back online and spilled the beans. What happened? My parents were too embarrassed to defend their actions this time, while the family was somewhat split before this incident. It was now a landslide in my favor. Nearly everyone in the family has sided with me after this incident, and those who haven't simply aren't siding with anybody, no matter how much my parents previously tried that. We did it for Dan Line, and now everyone's listening. So any remaining familial support they had is now gone. I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that many in the family who I expected wouldn't side with me did. Even the former flying monkeys are on board. It seems they've had enough, and I am thrilled about that. Around that time, I offered to host half the family at Christmas Eve in my new house, and they accepted my parents weren't invited. But that's okay. I was shocked to find that I wasn't blocked on my brother and Sill's profile. I was thrilled to see that Sel had her 4th baby in early November. They're still living with my parents, which is great. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because they kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if she could still guilt me. My parents must be thrilled to have their space again after dealing with 3 rowdy, obnoxious kids. A mentally unstable Sil, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Maybe they should try something new and move into a camper in their own backyard. That way, Dan could take over their house completely. They'd probably get some peace then, yeah. They could do that for Dan. There was supposed to be more, but this post got way too long. I'm excited to share part 3. Later on, LT2. I was trying to keep things to 2 posts, but I realized while compiling everything that part 2 was just too long. I'd split it into a part 3 for those who commented en masse to get cameras, and I'll be getting them. When I can afford it, I'm still in financial recovery from buying a house last year, but I am excited about the future. I am excited to get a good camera, but I am also aware that a decent computer is essential for recording. My current laptop is a few years old and runs Windows 10. But I am excited to upgrade soon. I am definitely keeping an eye out for doorbell cameras. That will be the first kind I get. For those who suggested that I should have just gotten my brother, and so arrested, the only reason I didn't was because they are parents. Their kids need them, and if Gan was arrested, he'd likely lose his job. Without that, his family doesn't have any money, and Seal has a 1-month-old baby right now. Neither of them needs to end up in jail. But you don't need jail for revenge. The police are there to help. I am not looking for revenge, but I did get my own justice without going to the police. Would I be this merciful again? More than likely not, and they know it. I decided to wait on making an account and posting until after the new year, just in case more stuff happened. And wouldn't you know it? As some of you may recall, my sister-in-law was making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were clearly directed at me, especially after Seal had her 4th baby in November. She posted the same repetitive nonsense. Over and over again, she found semi-clever ways of rewarding it. But she pretty much kept regurgitating that she was tired of living with my parents, that there isn't enough space, she needs her own house, and so on. I know I sound dismissive, but live through what I had with these people, and you'd be ready to sarcastically play tiny violins in front of them too. They're a unique bunch, to say the least, and since I waited until January to make an account, more happened, just like I thought I mentioned before. That I invited half the family to a Christmas Eve party at my house. Everyone I invited came, even though it was a fairly long drive of around 3 to 4 hours for them. They wanted to come and show me their support, and it was so heartwarming to see their commitment. I was showered with praise for my efforts in achieving independence and owning a home, and they expressed their sympathy for all that I'd been through. I was asked why I didn't just take my camper and drive the 3 hours back to them instead of living pretty much homeless for so long. I admitted sheepishly that I was very attached to living around here, and that I had my best employment opportunities in this area. My husband doesn't have many great job opportunities in my field, if any at all, and I wanted to make my own way as much as I could. They seemed to understand, and it was a great conversation. We moved on to having a rather nice party, the best I'd been in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, which added to the festive atmosphere. I was thrilled when my uncle brought a CD of Ray Charles' Christmas songs. It was my favorite. His renditions of Christmas songs are simply unparalleled. It was a grand and happy time. It was a moment. I felt like I could just forget my past issues and enjoy the moment. But I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. After about 2 hours, something truly amazing happened. My parents and brother showed up, looking radiant and happy to be there. They didn't even knock. They just walked right in my front door like they were meant to be there. I switched off the music and asked them to leave right away. They begged to stay and said they brought gifts. One of my uncles jumped up and started yelling at them. So I didn't get another chance to speak, he said. They don't deserve to be in my home or my life after what they tried to do months earlier. He was backed up by several other relatives. This guy is my mother's brother, and he used to be head over heels for her. Then he found out about the things that went on between me and my parents. My grandparents, my mother's parents, though advanced in age, jumped in and said to my parents, "If you want to make amends with me, it's a bit too soon." They've never been more disappointed in them than they were this past year. They kept their favoritism from my brother hidden for a long time. But no one was fooled anymore, and they needed to make a serious effort to try and actually treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be in my life again. Then they turned to Dan and Sil and said, they've seen the repetitive nonsense Sil keeps posting about. They're ready for a change and want to move on. Already, my house will not become their new home. Sil went back to her usual routine of a little crying and a pity party, but I am staying positive. She plopped down in a chair to have a tantrum and say it wasn't fair. I got this house to myself when I have no family of my own, and she has 4 kids that need more space. She just wanted a better place to live in and feel like a real mom. I know it was petty of me, but I couldn't help but point out that she could probably do better as a mother. After all, she lets my mother do most of the current while she sits on her butt all day, drinking, playing on her phone, or going out and spending all of Dan's money. I couldn't help but laugh when she complained about it. I even joked that I am surprised. Her baby doesn't get drunk from her milk since she drinks so much booze. I admit when I go a bit too far, like when I got some stares and Seal demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I told her that the evidence speaks for itself. If she's looking to one day leave my parents' house, she should definitely put her college degree to good use. A job and a little savings will be a great start. My mother is an amazing support system for my brother's kids, and she'll be able to dedicate more time to us guys once her baby gets a little older. My brother's eldest child, who is 7 years old, ran up to start kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom. He even told me that his mom said I was the bad guy who made her cry and didn't let them live here at that point. My brother intervened gently but firmly, pulling his son away. The other relatives jumped back in, and this spirited interaction turned into a lively family intervention. She was crying, her new baby was also crying, her kids were crying. Even Dan was almost moved to tears by the passionate words he was hearing. He ended up sitting on the ottoman. I keep shoes in by the front door looking like a complete wreck. He couldn't look anyone in the eye. He was too overwhelmed to say more than a few words to me. It was a thrilling moment, especially considering the entire house was filled with people eager to see him in his element. If they hadn't been there to get in his way, I bet this would have ended up a repeat of when he tried to order me around to try and take my house months earlier. At this point, though, he'd been so thoroughly humiliated that his and my parents' reputation in the family was completely destroyed because the masks were all now off. Soon after my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all left in defeat, the party resumed, and we all avoided speaking of what just happened for the rest of the evening, since most of the adults had been drinking. Everyone stayed the night in my house. I even let some of them sleep in the camper, so there'd be enough space, I admit. It also makes a great guest house. My relatives had asked to take a tour of it, and they were amazed that I'd been living in it for around 2 years. I got to answer all kinds of questions, like what it was like in the summer and winter, and so on. I was up with the chickens Christmas morning, ready to greet my guests with a fresh pot of coffee and some ibuprofen for those inevitable eggnog hangovers. I was thrilled to hear that I was considered a way nicer host than my parents ever were. Everyone agreed that it was such a success that we should all do it again next Christmas. After Christmas, Seal finally stopped posting obvious digs at me and deleted all the old ones. But recently, after the new year, she posted something new. She said she tried to convince my parents to get a camper like I did so it could be set up in the backyard. The idea was that Dan and his family could enjoy the entire house as their family home. Well, the taste of one's own medicine is never fun because my parents turned that idea down vehemently. I hear no one is going to push them out of their own home, let alone their master bedroom. The post was only up for a couple of days before my sister-in-law removed it, and she hasn't posted anything since then. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, can it still complain? I guess she's realized there is no point in doing it when no one hears her anymore. And Dan can't afford to move his family out on his salary alone anytime soon. If they end up expecting another child in the next few years, which I wouldn't be surprised by, things have calmed down for me since then. And I've even invited friends over for a poker night. I am not much of a poker player, but I love having friends over. But hey, it's all good. We get to drink beer and eat junk food while being merry. We all loaded up on Whoppers from Burger King and just had it the best way for grown men can when they just want to have a good, unadulterated time and get hessed out. I am seriously considering embarking on a new romantic journey this summer. I am not getting any younger, so I'm making the most of my time. Fingers crossed, it goes well. My camper is just sitting idle in my yard now, but I am excited to get it out and about again. Soon I'll admit there were days when I'd go out just to spend time in it. I lived in it for 2 years, and it was an incredible experience. It's like my second home. I can't wait to get it out on its first camping trip. I've never been camping before, but I am excited to try it out soon. My parents used to think camping was a waste of time, but I am determined to show them what it's all about. So it'd be a completely new experience for me. This marks the end of what happened, and the beginning of a new adventure. My parents, brother, and Sel have all been staying very clear of me, which I am sure is for the best. They've gone back to acting like I don't exist, like they did before I bought a house, but I am ready to move on. Not that it bothers me at all. It's better this way. I am sure they'll be back in the fold eventually. I am excited to see what they'll do next. If anything noteworthy comes of all this, I'll be sure to make another post, as long as this account is still active. I'll say 3. Some people who commented on my previous posts might be surprised, but my parents did some of the exact things they said they would. They wanted either my money or my signature. I did expect the classic lines of narcissists saying that I owed them, or give me some kind of socialist BS, but I'm glad I was wrong of sharing the wealth. But that was just my imagination running wild. The ensuing situation was somewhat similar to that, but much more tame, I guess you could say. It's like they figured out that I've got a limit. We're mostly aiming for pity and it's going well. It all started when my parents recently reached out to me on social media and asked to meet in a public place of my choosing. It felt like a scene out of a trap, but I wasn't worried. In fact, I was amused. They know I am not with anyone these days, so I was intrigued to see what they had in mind. This time I picked a local restaurant that has a name that sounds like an olive in a garden, and we met up there. Dan was with them, but he kept his mouth shut most of the time. We had our share of awkward greetings, ordered drinks, and then got right to the heart of the matter. My parents were enthusiastic about helping Dan get his own apartment so he could finally move out. Apparently, Dan's credit isn't so great. I am curious to know the reason behind that. Could it be his wife regularly spending him into a hole? They asked if I could help by providing some capital co-signing for the apartment and helping to pay the rent. I was thrilled at the prospect, but I politely declined both offers. That's when Dan spoke up, and he was passionate. He yelled at me that I have so much and I don't have a family to support like he does. He asked me to consider saving some of my money for his family since I don't have a family of my own. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed their help. That's right, they were pointing and laughing at me for being homeless. Or should we go further back to my childhood? I'd love to delve into that. With plenty of ears to listen, and around us my mother grabbed my hand and begged me not to speak of any of it. My father and Dan both just looked away and said nothing. I am pretty sure they wanted to say something like they used to at me, but held their tongues. I asked them if they thought I was rich or something, and they just looked at me. When I told them I didn't have that kind of money, they looked at me like deer in headlights. I broke it down for them, explaining how I'd managed to save up for the down payment on my house, and how I had to live and work in order to save that much money so quickly. I explained how I had saved so much, and then I spent nearly all of it on the down payment for my house. I am still in financial recovery, but I am so excited about my future. I did have monthly income to spare. Yes, but most of it was going right into my savings. I asked Dan what his yearly salary was, And when he told me, I pointed out that it was actually a bit higher than mine. I then did some quick math in front of my parents, showing that about 70% of my income goes to my mortgage insurance, gasoline, internet, phone, food, and other bills. I could put about 30% of that left at most into savings. I am determined to save that money and get back on my feet in time. I am determined to save up and be prepared for anything life throws my way. My truck is a 90s model, so it's definitely time for an upgrade. If it were to break down, I'd need money to either fix or replace it. And there are so many other things one would need a rainy day fund for, like home repairs, doctors, taxis, lawyers, or anything in general. You'd need quick cash for when it's a sudden unexpected expense. So as you can see, I just can't spare money for Dan, and I also refuse to cozy for anything, as that would leave me on a hook for any bill Dan couldn't or wouldn't pay. I pointed out, that's likely why my parents didn't cozy for Dan's apartment themselves long ago. My mother started crying again, but I was happy for her. I was pretty much one step ahead of them. In all of this, I am not an item, and I am not a fool. I told them as much straight up. I expected my father to become angry with me like he always does, but he didn't. But this time he he didn't. I've known this man to explode on me for the slightest provocation of not enabling my brother all of my life. But this time he didn't. There wasn't even a sneer on his face. The look on his face was one of regret and defeat. It could be a sense of regret for not being the best parent, or maybe he's realizing he can't bully me anymore. Who knows? Either way, my parents couldn't really argue with me, and I wasn't about to give them any money. Dan got up and said this was all just a waste of their time, and that he was leaving. My mother started apologizing for him, but Dan still wanted to leave. Then, to top it off, I offered to buy them a round of unlimited soup and salad while we were all there. I guess they couldn't turn down free food since we hadn't ordered anything but drinks yet, and wouldn't you know it, they stayed. I made a point of talking about anything but money. Dan remained quiet, either eating his food or looking at his phone. My parents joined in the conversation, and it was a really nice moment. They told me about their newfound passion for a local Christian church where they'd been going for the past 2 weeks. I said, good for them. And of course they started trying to convince me to go with them. I politely declined, expressing my appreciation for their interest. They were smart enough not to push further. When the meal was over, Dan left a $10 tip on the table and walked off without saying another word to me or anyone. My mother just excused his behavior and we all parted ways. That was about it. It may not have been as dramatic as some other situations I've experienced, but it was a significant improvement over the past. As for Seal, while she's been voicing her concerns online about my parents, she's come to realize that her role isn't as dominant as she thought. I think her chastity is finally getting to them, and that's great. It's so great to see them coming back to me. Seal actually wants my parents to move into a camper like I had to do in order to make space in the house. And while she's had her fair share of rejections, she's still hopeful. She does have a following of people who share her views, and I get messages every now and then from people I don't know. They're intent on telling me how I should give up my house for sale. I've learned to let these messages go, choosing not to engage in back and forth. I just block and move on. There was one persistent troll who had my phone number, and they call from a different number every time. It's the same person who called me to say I need to make way for a real family. I am not going to let that manly posture and shake my confidence. The calls have definitely slowed down, maybe even stopped, because I made it clear to that person that they were only amusing me by keeping this up so long. The last time they called was around the beginning of the month, and it's been quiet since then. LT4. I had planned to wait half a year or so after the original post to update everyone, but I am happy to report that it ended up being even longer than that. Yes, things could go bad again, but not really for me. I am doing great, almost unscathed since last Christmas, except for a few minor hiccups. One was when my parents and dad came to me for money, as I mentioned in my last post, and another was a recent double tip from my sister-in-law. I did get a few cameras from my house, including a Ring doorbell in front. I kept the new gear a secret from my family just to keep the fun going. I am thrilled to share that so far no one has attempted a break-in. I think the way I added them all before really scared them off, and now they've mostly left me alone. I've also started renting out 2 of the rooms in my house, one to a close friend and the other to a friend of said close friend. Both have been the best tenants ever. They're great tenants. They keep to themselves and leave me alone most of the time. They even have small refrigerators in their rooms, so they don't need to keep any of their drinks in the main fridge. I offered them an incredible deal on rent, and they couldn't have been happier. It's not just boosted my monthly income, but it's also been a huge help. With covering my mortgage, I bet you are curious about how my parents, brother, and sister-in-law feel about me renting out the rooms to friends. Well, the answer is not. My father and Dan didn't take it too well, but they've come around. In fact, my mother even came to me in tears asking how I could have rented those rooms to Dan and his family. We had a lively discussion where I pointed out that they had broken into my house before, and they had tried to steal it. She'd want to make sure anyone who did that would be a good fit. Also, there wasn't enough room for me, Dan, and his entire family in my house. I'd never share a roof with him, but that's not the point. It's a 3-bedroom manufactured home, and it's all mine. I have the master bedroom and its adjoining bathroom. That would have left only 2 small rooms for Dan, Sil, and 4 kids. I am sure it would have been a bit of a tight fit, but I am sure we could have worked it out. Also, she knows very well I can't be around Sil because she intentionally antagonizes me, and they all mocked me when I was homeless before. My current tenants are both single guys in their 30s, and they're great. I get along with them. My mother had some sobbing excuses for a while, but she finally let it go and admitted she was just desperate. Tet. Parents found out I was renting rooms out because Sil basically stopped me in some way. Then she told my parents, who contacted me, and then my mother came over to cry about it. Since then, my parents haven't bothered me once about the house. Things couldn't be better for me. My parents and Dan have their own journey, but they're handling it in their own way. It turns out Sil is a far worse person than I thought. I had a hunch that Sil was a bit of a drama queen, but wow. Did she go above and beyond? She really pulled out all the stops, but in the end the truth came out. Turns out Dan's youngest child isn't actually his. Yeah, you read that right. Still had an affair, which in retrospect isn't all that surprising. Some of you saw this coming a few months ago. After being caught, Sil was ousted from the family. Dan just recently finished with his divorce, which actually went in his favor since we thankfully live in an at-fault state. Dan also sued to get his name taken off the birth certificate of the youngest child and won. After the incident where my parents tried to force me to hand over my house, things got pretty tumultuous over at their house. Sil blamed me a lot, but I am sure that will change soon. She was convinced that I was rolling in money like I'd won the lottery and that I should share the wealth. It was her idea that they come to my Christmas party because she hoped they could all try to get on my good side. She also had the brilliant idea to have my parents and Dan try to get money from me for an apartment. So it was a real eye-opener when Dan and my parents filled her in on the true state of my finances. Up until then, she'd successfully cast a spell over them, feeding their narcissism with her own. So her blaming me made the rest of them blame me too. But then something incredible happened in front of the police. When they tried to steal my house, that's when the downfall for Sil really started. My parents and Dan were a bit hesitant about attending my Christmas party after their outburst, but they eventually agreed to just gather a few affordable gifts at the last minute and show up since he promised not to kick us out once we were there. Boy, was she wrong. She took a leap of faith and it paid off. I, with the full support of everyone I'd invited through her, decided to go ahead with the party. Her plan, which she thought was so clever, backfired spectacularly, I guess. Being chewed out by family at my party not only wrecked my parents' reputation even more, it actually started a wake-up call for them to eventually not listen to Sil anymore. As I mentioned in my last post, my parents decided to go back to church, probably because I'd said they probably would. I can't say that's the real reason, but you gotta admit it would feel kind of satisfying if that was the case. My parents hadn't been to church in 2 decades before going back, and I am excited to see what happens. While I don't think it's a bad idea that they're going to church, they need to understand that going doesn't just give them a do-over for all the things they've done in the past. I am hopeful that they'll try, and I appreciate that they came to my house without Dan to apologize in person. After watching an animated video of my first 3 posts, that's right. They've known about this Polsky account for a long time now. They're in the loop with everything I am sharing. Yes, they're unhappy about it, but I feel everyone here deserves an update since it's anonymous. For my parents and Dan, seeing the animated video of themselves and their own actions was a great way to make them see what kind of people they really are. They even came over to apologize to me later. I'd never seen my father apologize like that to anyone, and the man isn't a good actor. It felt so genuine. They fully acknowledged what they did to me and how Tahir is no excuse for any of it. They even described themselves as narcissists and admitted the truth that they had wronged me very badly. Then they went on to blame Sel for a lot of things. They did kind of throw her under the bus, but it's true that she was guilty of everything they said. My parents have been getting counseling for a while now, and it offers group family counseling, but I declined as I am not ready for that anytime soon. Dan himself took some time to apologize, but he's been showing a lot of remorse whenever the past is brought up. Meanwhile, Dan and Sel's marriage absolutely fell apart. It wasn't a crumble, it was a cascade. I was the one who had to deal with everything, and they couldn't mock or take advantage of me anymore. After the public humiliation of social media, my Pashu posts, and the animated online video, Sel finally let out enough of her toxic on Dan and my parents for them to realize she's not the person they thought she was. Their denial had been strong, but Sel's entitlement was stronger. I've had many a thought of lightsabers crashing over this drama. Sel clad like a bimbo fuck, with a lightsaber that looks like a giant lipstick or something like that. I can't help but imagine the countless jokes and puns that could be made, but I'll leave the details for your imagination. But as you can imagine, things only got worse because Sil kept looking for other ways to get what she wanted. She kept bringing up ads for used campers and RVs to try and get my parents to buy one to live out of, so they could have the main house. And she just kept going no matter how many times they told her to stop. She even tried to suggest that my parents should just buy an RV and have a life on the road like normal old people do. That was a bold idea. Even for Seal, my parents suggested that Dan and Seal buy a camp for themselves to live out of it. Instead, Seal boldly declared that she shouldn't have to do that since she's the mom. She even lauded the fact that she thought she had total parental authority over everyone's heads because the kids in the house were all hers. When Seal didn't get her way, she actually took her baby and left the house to disappear for several days. They were confident she was doing well because her phone was still working, and she was responding to texts with short, passive-aggressive answers. When she came back, she was more embittered than ever because nobody gave in to her demands while she was away. Seal also decided to skip church, which was a new twist. Dan went with our parents, bringing his kids along for the adventure, except for the youngest, since Seal wasn't quite on board with that idea. Peasany, I don't go to church. I believe in God and all that stuff, but I just don't like church. It just wasn't my cup of tea growing up. Alt 5 Part 2. I am thrilled to share that much of this information came from Dan and my parents. I'm just sharing what I know. Things really heated up when Dan suddenly called out his wife as a cheater. It was a shocking revelation, especially since we all thought you was her biggest supporter. But no, he's not. At least not anymore. You all know how he treated me when I was on his bad side. Well, his wife wasn't spared that. I heard it all. He started putting pieces together about her deceit, after finally pulling his head out of his ass, and secretly got DNA tests for all his kids. 3 of his kids are his, but the youngest one, the baby, wasn't. For the record, Dan and I both have dark straight hair that's almost black. Our parents have similar hair, which is a beautiful family trait. Sil's hair is straight, and pretty dark too, but the baby's hair is lighter and a bit curly. At first, I thought it was just because of the baby's age, but that was just the beginning. Sel kept playing it off and said that it would darken in time, but the baby's hair never got darker. I guess that was Dan's biggest clue. He confronted his wife with the DNA results in front of our parents, and she broke down sobbing that it was a mistake. Seal pulled out all the stops, denying trickling, truthing, and gaslighting. But it was all in the name of love. But Dan had none of it, and actually had done more to find out about her affair than I would have ever thought. I knew he was smart. He just let himself be done. He had detailed proof of her cheating with phone records. Taxi got off her phone bank records, and the DNA test. He even identified the man she's cheating with. He was likely the father since he is much lighter colored and has curly hair. The evidence against her was crystal clear. Dan said she didn't even try to hide her affair, and he figured it all out easily. Once he started looking, my parents were thrilled and demanded that she leave their house immediately. That's when she went on them all. She started with yelling, but quickly escalated to physical violence. My mother called the police, and sure enough, Facile was arrested. She scratched up Dan and my father quite a bit with her long fake nails. She even got her eldest kid involved when she hit him hard enough to give him a black eye and a nosebleed when he tried to intervene. Dan was smart enough to have his phone recording nearby when he confronted her. This allowed the police to easily arrest her for assault. The Sale's parents had to drive over to bail her out. Then they came back for the baby Sale's stuff, in her car as well a couple days after Sale got bailed out. She showed up at my house, because I was apparently next on her sheet list. As soon as I opened the door, she went on an epic rant where she called me out about posting on Heisty, then said I was the entitled vein of her existence. I am not sure, but I think she might have been high on something because this felt extra crazy for her, and her eyes didn't look right. She said that mothers with young children are the most sacred thing in the world, and she went on yelling that giving up my house shouldn't have been too much to ask for, because supporting the family was the least I could have done. She said that if I had done that, her family would still be together. When I tried to talk, while she was spewing all that out, she actually attempted to shove me and cover my mouth. She even had her hand poised like she was ready to scratch me. Well, that went about as well with me as you can expect. I am not one to be threatened, so I told her I'd call the police if she didn't take her hands off me right away. I also let her know that I had footage of the incident on my doorbell camera. She started panicking the moment she heard the camera. I gave her a good talking to, and she backed off. I told her she had some gall to call me entitled when she's exactly that. She didn't work for anything she had anymore. She cheated on her husband and got pregnant from her affair partner. She made my mother do most of the careering for our children, spent Dan's money until they were in a financial hole, and acted entitled to my home to the point of trying to steal it. I called her entitled X100 and said she's a greedy person blinded by narcissism. I told her to stop blaming me for her actions and to never show up at my house again. After a lively exchange, I hightailed it out of there, ready to move on to greener pastures. This was the last straw for me. Now that she was separated from Dan, I finally went to the police and filed a report on her for harassment and the assault she'd done on me last year, and her putting her hands on me at my front porch only added to it. The police have it all on record now. I even gave copies of the video to Dan's divorce lawyer. I also filed for a restraining order against Sel. The court granted it without hesitation, recognizing the serious nature of the allegations. She hasn't posted anything about me on social media since then, which is great. She's probably just keeping her profile on private. I am sure her blame game has already sailed. Either way, she's left me alone, which is great. Seal was still with her affair partner during the divorce. But that's water under the bridge. I had no idea what kind of man he was at the time, but I am sure he's a great guy. Once the divorce was ended, Seal admitted that Dan just wasn't man enough for her anymore because he couldn't afford to give her the bajol she wanted. She saw herself as a trophy wife and felt that her relationship should be with someone wealthy. Dan pulled Amy and maniacally laughed at her. He said she wasn't hot enough to be a trophy wife and mentioned any other faults she had. This led to a playful showdown where Amy ran off much like a child. To living with her parents, Sil was able to gain first-hand experience in the family business. She had already maxed out all the credit cards he had given her, and she complained about having to work for her parents even though she had a college degree. I'm sure they were the only ones who'd employ her anyway, since she's got a criminal record and a decade-long gap in her resume. I've heard from Dan that her parents were severely disappointed in her as well, but that was just a rumor. They might be just as bad as her, but I am excited to find out the divorce really took off once it got going, and that was exciting. Seal didn't walk away with much from it, especially because she had an affair physically hurt her Phil husband and eldest child, and it's an at-fault state like I mentioned earlier. So she kissed any chance of getting her way goodbye. I'll dive into all the juicy details on the final post. Update 6 Part 3. This is what I know of the divorce from my brother Dan. Dan's lawyer was great and got the divorce started right away, but it cost him. I am eager to share the nitty-gritty details and the total cost in the final post. Update 6 Part 3. They never spilled the beans, but I am excited to share all the juicy details in my upline post. On the other hand, he was in a tough spot financially, and you know what can happen when you corner an animal. She put up a fight, but the law wasn't on her side, and her dwindling finances made it difficult. Fortunately, her sales parents generously covered her legal expenses, and the lawyer they hired was quite skilled. She even brought her affair partner to the divorce court to testify on her behalf. This guy was quite the character. He had a silver tongue and a charming smile that he tried to use to his advantage. He claimed that Seal had been wronged by an incompetent husband, which is why she sought the arms of another man. He claimed he was ready to take responsibility for his child. He had fathered with Seal, but that Seal would still be needing the alimony for helping support herself and care for said child. He even remarked that because Dan was still on the birth certificate, alimony should be one of his obligations. Dan said, "This guy used big words and a charming smile, but seemed an extra special kind of stupid, and coming from Dan, that's saying something." The judge, however, was not swayed and firmly told Dasim's tone that he was a hypocrite for claiming to be ready to take responsibility for his child, while also seeking money from the man whose marriage he had helped to ruin. Dan was even prepared to sue his wife's affair partner for alienation of affection. However, that plan didn't quite work out as expected. It would have been up to Dan to prove how much she loved him before the affair began. But after her mask came off and we saw the real her, we're not sure if she ever really loved him at all, or if she just loved having a meal ticket. Quote, someone here pointed out that Seal might have been busy having kids to avoid getting a job. And you may have been right either way. Seal tried dragging out the divorce, but Dan's lawyer and the judge kept it from happening much. I am convinced that Dan was incredibly fortunate to have a judge who was so tough on unfaithful spouses. All the evidence we had on Seal made it easy to keep her from playing the victim. Instead of keeping up the act, she just let her true self shine through because there was no point in hiding it anymore. The court had all of the records provided by Dan and myself, police reports, photos, and recordings to prove she was an abusive. Seal faced an uphill battle, but we were confident in our strategy. She bravely attempted to stand against the mountain, but it was like trying to stop an avalanche in progress. In the end, we settled the divorce quickly and efficiently. Dan generously took on 3/4 of the credit card. Dad agreed to have his name removed from the affair, and was thrilled to have his name on the baby's birth certificate. Seal walked away with partial custody of her children, no alimony, and the majority of the credit debts she had accumulated were discharged. Her employment through her parents meant she had an income of her own to fall back on and start paying off her debts. The best part, she gets to see her other kids almost whenever she wants and can take them on weekends. While it's true that she hasn't made many attempts to see them, she's still working on it. She's taken them out for fast food on occasion, but she's never taken them home with her. Now that the kids are back in school, she's got even less time to see them. You'd think her parents would want to see their grandchildren, but they haven't contacted Dan about it. They barely saw Dan's children before that either. Now they may not even bother to see them at all. I am curious. Do they have a different perspective on family life? Even Dan doesn't know. Dan says his in-laws were always indifferent to him, but that's not going to stop him from seeing his grandchildren. As for Dan, well, he really did love his wife a lot, so when he found out about her affair, it was a real eye-opener. Let's Billy back to the night of his confrontation with his wife. He came to me in a stupor with a whiskey bottle in hand and his face all scratched up and covered advantages. I wouldn't say he was drunk yet, but I thought out seeing him looking like that at first. Then I berated him for driving under the influence, but that didn't really mean much to him compared to the betrayal of his cheating ex-wife. We spent a few hours in my camper catching up and making sure my tenants weren't disturbed all the while. Dan was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and crying that he's a fool and how he regretted ever marrying Sil. Now whenever he talks about her, he simply refers to her as that, so that's his sister's nickname. It's funny, but this time together was the most bonded that I've been in 15 years. Well, he didn't exactly apologize to me. He called himself a bottom human being with terrible taste in women. Gunn said I at least didn't make his mistakes, despite all he did to me in the past. He's still my younger brother and I couldn't risk letting him try to drive home. So I invited him to spend the night and managed to get his keys. I set up a cozy bunk in my camper for him, and we had a great time. I rented out my spare rooms. After all, he was in no shape to drive home. If he'd taken an Uber, he'd have to pay for it, and then come back for his car later. He was still a depressed, crying mess, and didn't want our parents or his kids to see him like that. I was a little worried. He might do something crazy if I let him leave, but I figured it was best for everyone involved. I didn't want him to sleep in the house, so putting him in the camper was the best option. Just because he was there didn't mean I suddenly trusted him. It was better for him to sleep it off in the camper. We had a blast spending time in the camper playing games and watching movies on my portable Debleed player. Player was no fun with. Just two people and an old maid was just boring. Zexy, I had an Uno deck and an old school battleship game too. He really liked those. It kept him occupied until he finally decided to call it a night. Probably after running out of whiskey, he did end up puking a lot, but he was game to sleep in my camper. In fact, he found the idea kind of cool. Dan was curious about how I had managed to live in the camper for such a long time. I was happy to share my experiences with him, and he seemed intrigued. I was keen to get some rest, though as I had to rise early the next day, I left him with my portable Debleed player, which had a couple of movies on it. I left him with a couple of movies to keep him busy, and I figured he'd be able to stay awake before leaving for work. In the morning, I popped in while Dan was passed out in the bunk and left a bottle of ibuprofen and an energy drink on the counter of the camper's kitchenette. I also left his car keys and a letter explaining to leave through the backyard gate. He managed to leave without any trouble around 1:30 p.m., about a month after Exeterake that was kicked out. Then Dan came to me asking to borrow my camper. I guess he found it more comfortable than I thought when he slept in it. He cheerfully admitted that he had been waiting to ask for it out of pride. Now that his soon-to-be ex-wife has moved out, he's generously offered his eldest child the use of his room. He has 2 girls and a boy, with the boy being the eldest, and now 8 years old. The kids were all forced to share a room, but now they can each have their own space. Up. Until that point, they had just curtains up for the boy's half of the room. The boy would often sleep on the couch to avoid his sisters, but now he can have his own room. I know the poor kid was longing for his own space. So I guess Dan decided to finally make a better decision as a dad and came to see me in order to beg to borrow my camper. So his son could have his own room. If he could have afforded it, he'd have bought his own camper instead of relying on me, and Egan said as much. I hadn't even gotten the chance to use the camper for actual camping yet, but I was happy to let him use it since it was for a good cause, and he promised to buy his own in time. Anyway, I didn't even ask for rent money for the camper. Dan's financial situation is a bit tight right now, but I am confident he'll get through it. The divorce really took a toll on him. I've discovered that I get far better results with family lately by not being spiteful. I loaded up my camper and parked it in my parents' backyard, and my father even put in a 30-amp breaker, so Dan can run heat and AC when he needs it. I do miss the camper after all that time living in it. It truly felt like it was a part of me. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to lend it out to support the dance kids. I've formed such a bond with the kids, and it's for them that I am willing to do anything for my parents or Dan. I'm aware that it might not be back in my hands for a while, and it might not be in its original condition when it is. But that's part of the adventure. I've made sure to let Dan and my parents know that they'll be responsible for any damage or upkeep while they have it. I've documented the camper's condition with Tartamp pictures and videos before lending it out, so I can ensure it's in top shape. Dan even recorded a video as me agreeing to my terms. This is basically a contract, and it's as good as it gets. With the financial challenges of divorce, Dan won't be able to get a place of his own for years. Dan seems to be enjoying living in the camper, which is great. I am not sure if he actually likes it, or if he's just putting up a front. But either way, it's all good. I can't help but think it reminds him of the backyard forts we had as kids, since that's how it felt with me sometimes. Either way, he's living in it now, and that's all that matters. I was thrilled to receive major props from the extended family for letting him borrow it too. I am now referred to by a lot of them as the good brother, which is awesome. Dan doesn't deserve either way, but I am thrilled to see him enjoying it. I am thrilled that we've taken steps to strengthen our family bond. I still have little care for my brother and parents after the way they treated me all my life, but I am working on it. But I am not going to let Dan's kids suffer for it. I am thrilled to say that those kids have really warmed up to me. They're over the moon to see me whenever I come over or visit. I've even been lucky enough to babysit a few times, and I've noticed the positive change in their behavior, especially towards me. I am having a blast being an uncle, and it's a wonderful feeling to see the bond forming. My mother is still doing the bulk of the cribbing for my nibblings, and she's been acting as nice as possible to stay on my good side. My father, on the other hand, often looks a bit defeated around me, but otherwise he's been either quiet or really nice. While he doesn't talk to me as much as I'd like, it's still a huge improvement from before. I'm doing my best to keep my guard up. But I am also trying to be open to the possibility of new connections. Either way, I am staying positive. My parents seem genuinely happy that my ex-sister is gone, and they often joke that they don't know what they ever saw in her, especially my mother. His mom has been here for a long time now for the last part. At the same time as the divorce, Dan sued to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the baby that wasn't his. That didn't really want to change it because it meant no more child support from Dan, as she did. However, there was a court-ordered paternity test for the man identified as the baby's father. I was prepared to laugh in case it turned out he wasn't the father either, but I was thrilled to be wrong. But he was. Dan's lawyer had a long talk with Exeter's lawyer. Exeter had no leg to stand on, and Dan was ready to go to bat to make her situation even worse. She didn't have the financial resources to continue fighting him, and she agreed to change the birth certificate. The bronze-tongued man who'd been her child's father took on financial responsibility, and they ended up not staying together. He contacted Dan through his lawyer to let him know he had called it quits and wouldn't be bothering him again. I checked the social media of that guy after Dan linked me to it, and the lout was upset that now he's financially responsible for a child he never planned to have, and that he's too young for this. Dan's lawyer found out that the man is just over 40, which is great, because it means he's still got plenty of time to enjoy life and all that it has to offer. He looks younger than he is, but he's definitely not a young man. Shortly after that, he put his online profile on private Exeter, which he had already done with hers a long time. I am at the end of my information, but I am so excited to see what happens next. This could be the end of the road for us. Exeter is out of our hair. My parents and brother have finally made a real effort to be better people, and I couldn't be happier for them. I am thrilled to be an uncle, and my house is still my house. It's heaven. No surprise here, but Exeter saw my poly posts. She can't contact me about them, thanks to my restraining order. She probably can't afford a lawyer right now since the divorce financially drained her too. She complained to Dan about it and demanded he tell me to delete my Palsy account. But not only has Dan read my recent posts, he no longer cares. He said they remind him of the prick he used to be, but he's not losing sleep over it. I still helped him out despite all he's done to me. So here is no cause for him to be upset. My parents have also made sure to treat Dan and me equally, which is really cool of them. My father is still a man of few words around me, though someone pointed out that changing now, after so long of treating me as the opposite of Dan, means he doesn't know how to connect with me anymore. I think they're right. I don't mind the way he is now, though my mother has also developed a habit of saying she's sorry about every little thing in my presence. Dan told me that she and my father have been scolded by extended family and our counselor. Now my mother feels like she needs to apologize for everything. This is such a change from how they used to treat me. Also, I didn't talk about before what Exeter's opinion was on Dan borrowing my camper so his son could have his in Exeter's old bedroom. She looked down on him and even mocked him about it, saying he was living like a bum. Dan, however, took it all in stride and even joked with her, asking if she was done. Yet, because he knew this was exactly how she'd react, he's so confident and self-assured that he just doesn't care anymore. He's over it all, and her insults went in one ear and out the other. Then he pointed out to her that he was living out of the camper because he was putting his kids ahead of himself, so his son could have his own room, something his ex never did despite being their mother. She just used her children and pregnancy as weapons to avoid working and to emotionally blackmail everyone. Then, with a playful smile, he asked her to remind him how that was working out for her. This was early on in their divorce, and it was clear they were both open to new possibilities. I am sure you could all guess her reaction. Dan mentioned that his ex had a bit of a fit about my recent posts, but no one stepped up to the plate to contact me on her behalf to take them down. So she'll just have to deal with the consequences of her actions. She's been on a charm offensive with Dan lately. It's like the grass isn't so green after all. Living with her parents, Dan tolerates her as the mother of his children whenever they meet, but nothing more. He's made it clear that she won't be coming back into his life. He's told me that he can't look at her the way he used to, but that's okay. The mere thought of her is enough to send him into a state of emotional disarray. So while Exeter may not have the best chance of reconciliation, here is always hope for the future. I don't have any new intel on his affair partner. His social media is still locked down, so I am not sure what I am missing. The same goes for Exeter. As long as I have a chance to read them, I am sure I'll be able to find out more. Out to 8 happened in the middle of the night, / very early morning on the 1st. I suspect it was my Exeter, but the person my cameras recorded was wearing layers of heavy sweats, and had their face wrapped up along with big glasses covering the eyes. You couldn't really tell if they were a man or woman. They came on foot, so there is no way to tell if it was a man or a woman. They did look about as tall as Exeter, which is a pretty solid piece of evidence. If it was Exeter, she knew about my cameras, so covering her face and body for petty eggy revenge was probably the smartest thing she's done in years. She really put her college degree to use by egging that beat-up old pickup truck. The egger showed up around 3, but I was deep asleep and didn't hear a thing. The culprit threw a dozen eggs or so at my truck, adding a touch of color to the night. They didn't attempt to do any more damage at least, and were gone in a flash. As soon as the last egg was thrown, they were gone. I didn't see the mess till I was leaving for work in the morning. I hopped out of bed and took my truck to a local car wash. During my lunch break, that took most of the egg off. I hopped back in my truck and was on my way ready to tackle any other little messes that might pop up during the day. Egg isn't the best for the paint, but the truck is from the 90s and doesn't exactly look mint. I took some awesome photos and filed a police report with the cease to Pee-wee fudged as evidence. I am hoping to get some more details soon. There was no real damage other than my minor irritation and $15 at the car wash, so I am pretty optimistic. If Exeter did do this, she was smart enough to only throw eggs and not keep my paint or slash my tires, so my insurance wouldn't be involved. I should feeling optimistic that the police report will lead to some interesting developments. The cops seem to think it was probably just a prank by a teenager, but I am hopeful. I totally understand that the cops were probably swamped, but it's great that the report will keep a paper trail in case of future incidents. I've been waiting to share this because I was curious to see if anything else would come up. But no, It's right back to the peace and quiet we all love. But I'd love to hear any advice on the matter just in case something like this happens again, Alday. I asked around with some people on the street about cameras possibly seeing the person who hugged my car. My responses ranged from, "We don't have cameras," to, "It was Howley and people pull stupid pranks." I am sure it was just a silly prank. The helpful folks I chatted with pointed out that I could have asked sooner, and the footage was automatically deleted. So basically the EGR got away. If it was still, she must have walked around a half mile in those sweats just to avoid being spotted on camera. I'm sure she questioned if it was even worth the effort, but I am excited to see what happens. I am just going to sit back and see if the egger makes a comeback next year. I did hand out printed pictures of the egger though, and even stapled a few up on posts. Now the tenants renting out 2 rooms in my house have stayed out of it, and the people in my neighborhood are aware, and I don't really blame them. It's not their problem, and I am excited to see what happens.